Hello guys, and welcome back to another video. This video differs a bit from the content that's regularly done on this channel, as today I'll be doing some 3D printer stuff. I'm waiting on some packages to arrive for some more computer videos here soon, and I'm also a bit sick, so sorry if that's noticeable in my voice. I hope that some of you will be interested in this video due to the results of the poll I did in my community tab a bit back, but I guess I'll just have to see. This is one of my 3D printers that has been in a state of disrepair and neglect for the past while because of some of the printing issues it had that I could not manage to fix. Today, I'll be giving it some little upgrades and then trying to calibrate it with the new upgrades. Let's get started. Here's the upgrade kit that I'll be installing today. It's nothing too crazy, just some upgraded Bowden tubing / fittings and some new bed leveling springs. It only costs about $12 on Amazon. I'm going to install the new Bowden tubing first, and to do that I'll heat up the hot end and move the Z-axis up a little bit just so that it's easier to work on. With the Z-axis set at the right height, I can unscrew the fitting that holds the Bowden tube to the extruder, as I'll be replacing the fittings as well as the tubing, so might as well take them off now. I'll also just unscrew the fitting that holds the Bowden tubing to the hot end because I can never seem to pull the tubing out of these fittings, and this just seems to be the easiest way to do this. Here you can see the old Bowden tubing. A bit of old filament in there and some damage to the end of it. The only other thing that I'll use this old tube for before throwing it out is to measure a new length of Bowden tubing that I'll cut off with the included tool. Now for the installation. I'll just put a new hot end fitting in, push the tube all the way in until it certainly bottoms out, and do the same once more for the extruder end. With that all completed, it's time to feed some filament in and set the extruder to start extruding so we can check if it's all working properly. It seems to be working correctly here, which is always good to see. Oh, and one last thing before I mark the Bowden upgrade is complete, I'll put a few zip ties on the tubing and cable like it was before so that they don't drift apart or tangle whatsoever. Now for the bed springs. These are a pretty simple install. They start by unscrewing the big adjustment knobs from the bed all the way so that we can get full access to the stock bed springs. Then it's just a matter of removing the old spring and replacing it with the new one on all 4 corners. Here you can see the difference between the old and the new bed springs. The new ones are much, and I mean much, stiffer than the old ones, which supposedly gives more control and a stabler bed. After replacing the springs on all 4 corners, it's time to put the adjustment knobs back on and tighten them all the way down in a cross pattern. I choose to tighten them all the way down because these springs are not able to compress nearly as much as the stock springs. On my other Ender 3, which I've already done this mod to get the right bed level with the stock springs, they were nearly entirely compressed, which wasn't the case on this one, and I find that a bit odd. And yes, the micro switch that zeroes the Z-axis is in the same spot on both of them. Who knows? In any case, to avoid any more nozzle crashing nightmares, of which this print bed has seen many, as is evident by the battle scars it possesses, I'll make sure the bed is as low as possible to start. At this point I realized that I had entirely forgotten to mention another little bit of maintenance that I wanted to do to the printer while I was here, a quick nozzle swap. To do this, I just removed the shroud that covers the hot end and holds the fans used to cool it by unscrewing 2 tiny bolts that hold it on. I then turned on the printer and set the hot end temperature to close to its maximum and let it heat up. I also made sure to remove the little silicone sock that's on the hot end before it got too hot to touch. Now it's finally time to remove the old nozzle, which is a pretty easy task. Just grab the heater block with a wrench to support it and unscrew the nozzle with another wrench. Make sure you have something to catch the hot nozzle, and it fell off the thing I was going to use to catch it, straight onto my easily melted anti-static mat. Convenient. Well, I guess the mat's going to have another battle scar. It'll join the heat gun heat shrink tubing scar as well as the few scars from solder dripping onto it. Putting the new nozzle in is easy. I always try to thread it in as far as I can by hand before too much heat transfers from the hot block into the nozzle. Once it gets too hot to handle, I switch to the wrench to tighten it down. Only ever go slightly snug with these nozzles, as you don't want to risk stripping out the hot and soft aluminum block. Put the cover with the fans back on, test to make sure that the filament extrudes properly, and we're done here. Now, on my other Ender 3 with the slightly odd bed level, I had to raise the Z-axis zeroing micro switch a bit to get the nozzle high enough to the point that it wouldn't try to print below the bed. I thought to do that here to avoid possible nozzle destruction when trying to level the bed, but it turns out that this was a terrible idea as it only set the print head way too high. I ended up lowering it to about the same height as it was before, and now everything was working just fine. Finally, it was time to get this hot end printing. Well, that's less than ideal for sure, but at least it's not etching the bed while grinding down the precision tip of the nozzle. After only a little bit of frantic on-the-fly bed level adjusting, I started to have something that looked somewhat reasonable. I'd fine-tune this better later, but for a starting point to start printing calibration cubes and setting steps per millimeter numbers, this is good enough. This first layer was great. The second one wasn't as great, but we can deal with that later when calculating E-steps. The first layer also measured about 0.2 millimeters in height, which is exactly the target height set in the slicer, which was great to see. Time for the first calibration cube of what I'll soon come to see several. The first one was, well, rough to say the very least. It's got this massive and weird bulge about the 6mm mark on the print, and the rest of it doesn't look too great either. The X size was alright, and the Y size was also alright, and the Z size needed emergency surgery. Setting the Z-axis steps per millimeter was my priority, as due to how off the Z-axis was, I thought that it may help some of the other aspects of the print if I fixed it, so I started with that. I calculated the new Z-step value by multiplying the current number of steps per millimeter by the target size in millimeters, and then I divided that by the size that I actually got to get a value of about 417.8 steps per millimeter. With the new Z steps per millimeter value set, and make sure to hit the store settings on your way out of that menu or it'll get wiped when you power cycle a printer, I learned that the hard way myself, it was time to print another test cube. This one came out better. It's got some different issues, like gaps between the layers probably caused by under extrusion, and it's still got that weird lump around the 6mm mark. I cleaned just a bit of gunk off of the lead screw and added some fresh silicone lubricant to see if that would help in this next print. It didn't seem to make that much of a difference. At this point, it was clear that this was not going to be as easy a job as I thought it would be, and it was time to start fighting with this printer to make it print the way that I want it to. I chose to calibrate the X and Y steps in the same way that I did for the Z steps, and then I also decided to calibrate the E steps. Calibrating the E steps of a printer can be quite scary seeming to be a beginner, but it's actually simple. All you must do is mark the filament where it enters the extruder and then mark it again 100mm down the line. Once that's done, you can tell the printer to extrude 100mm of filament and wait for it to finish doing that. With the extrusion of what should have been 100mm completed, we can check back on our filament. We'll mark where it enters the extruder right now and use that as another little point of reference. If the 100mm mark you made before is past the extruder entrance, your printer is over extruding and you need to add the distance between the 100mm mark and the new extruder assembly entry mark to the original 100mm. That will give you the length of the filament that was truly extruded, and you can calculate the E steps in the same way that we did the X, Y, and Z steps with this info. If the 100mm mark does not go into the extruder, however, you can subtract the length between the 100mm mark and the new extruder assembly entry mark from the desired 100mm. And lastly, if your 100mm mark is right where the filament enters the extruder assembly, it's extruding perfectly. In my case, the printer was under extruding, and it missed about 10.5mm of filament, meaning it only extruded 89.5mm. Now that I had that set, another print was set off. The print seemed fine except for the same ridge around the 6mm mark, which is almost definitely an issue with the Z-axis in one way or another. The new X and Y step values also seem to be working just fine, which is very nice to see. More and more adjustments and more cubes, but still no disappearance of the ridge. That is, until I readjusted the lead screw and loosened the eccentric nuts on the rollers for the Z-axis, at which point the ridge became a lot less pronounced and is pretty much to an acceptable level for me for the time being. I'm almost certain that this is an artifact of a flat spot on a roller that's part of the Z-axis, but I don't have any new rollers on hand, and replacing the rollers on the Z-axis is a very involved task, so that'll wait for another day. For now though, the ridge is barely there. It looks a lot worse on camera, trust me. And I'll call this maintenance/upgrade session a 90% success for now. This is a bit of a different subject matter than what this channel usually covers, and don't worry, I'm not turning into a 3D printer channel. I've got some more computer videos coming here soon, but some packages are taking a while to come, and I figured that this video could be entertaining for some people, so I figured why not make it. I hope to see you all next time. Goodbye.